The night my family raised their glasses to celebrate my failure was the same night I decided they would lose everything. I remember that moment clearly. The lights in the restaurant were warm and golden. Soft music played in the background. People were laughing at nearby tables. To anyone watching from outside, it probably looked like a normal family dinner. But it wasn't. It was my funeral. At least, that's how they saw it. My name is Daniel Whitmore. I'm 62 years old. For 35 years, I built one of the largest regional construction companies in the state. From nothing. No rich parents. No investors. Just long days, sleepless nights, and a stubborn belief that hard work still meant something. Whitmore Construction. It started with one truck, 2 workers, and a borrowed toolbox. Over the years, it grew into something bigger than I ever imagined. Office buildings, shopping centers, housing developments, bridges. My company built half the skyline in our county, and my family enjoyed every second of that success. My wife, Margaret, my son, Kevin, my daughter, Laura, they lived in the big house, drove expensive cars, took vacations in places I had only seen in magazines when I was younger, and I never complained, because I believed I was doing it for them. That was my first mistake. The second mistake was trusting them. 3 months before that dinner, everything changed. At least, that's what they thought. It started with the phone call. I was sitting in my office late one evening. The building was quiet. Most of the staff had already gone home. My desk lamp was the only light in the room. The phone rang. It was my CFO, Richard. His voice sounded tense. "Daniel, we need to talk." When someone who has worked with you for 20 years says that in that tone, you already know the news isn't good. He came into my office 20 minutes later with a stack of papers. Debt reports, project losses, legal notices. The market had turned faster than anyone expected. 2 major developers had pulled funding from projects we were already halfway through building. Millions of dollars frozen overnight. Banks started calling. Suppliers demanded payment. The company that had taken me 35 years to build was suddenly standing on the edge of a cliff. I listened quietly while Richard explained the numbers. To anyone else, it would have sounded like the end. But strangely, I wasn't panicking. I had seen hard times before. Still, the next few weeks became a nightmare. Lawyers, emergency meetings, bank negotiations, new investors refusing to step in. And then, the decision. Bankruptcy. When the paperwork was filed, the news spread through the business world like wildfire. Whitmore Construction had collapsed. 35 years of work gone. At least that's what the newspapers said. But the newspapers didn't hurt nearly as much as what happened at home. The first person who changed was my wife. Margaret had always loved the life my business provided. Charity galas, designer clothes, country club lunches. When the news broke, she stopped looking at me the same way. It was subtle at first. Small things. Her tone when she spoke to me. The way she sighed when bills arrived. The way she stopped defending me when people talked about the bankruptcy. Then came Kevin. My son was 35. He had worked in the company for years. But if I'm honest, he never had the discipline to build something himself. He liked the title. Vice President. He liked the office. He liked the company car. But the moment things went wrong, his loyalty disappeared. One evening, he came into my study. He didn't sit down. "Dad," he said, "you should have seen this coming." I looked up slowly. "What do you mean?" He crossed his arms. Everyone in the industry knew the market was unstable. That was the first time my own son spoke to me like I was an idiot. Then came Laura. My daughter had always been closer to her mother. She ran a small online boutique, mostly funded by money I gave her over the years. When she visited the house after the bankruptcy announcement, she hugged Margaret. She barely looked at me. But the real moment, the moment I realized everything had changed, came 2 weeks later. Kevin called a family meeting. He said we needed to talk about finances. We sat in the living room of the house I had bought 20 years earlier. Margaret sat beside Kevin. Laura sat across from me. And for the first time in my life, I felt like a stranger in my own home. Kevin cleared his throat. "Dad, we need to be realistic." "Realistic? I hate that word. What are you suggesting?" I asked calmly. He exchanged a glance with Margaret. Then he said it. "You should sell the house." I stared at him. "The house?" He nodded. "We can't maintain this lifestyle anymore." Maintain this lifestyle. I almost laughed. The lifestyle I had spent decades building. Margaret finally spoke. "Daniel, Kevin is just being practical." Practical? That word again. I leaned back in my chair. "And where exactly do you expect me to go?" Laura answered before anyone else. There are smaller places outside the city. Smaller places. I looked around the living room. The expensive furniture. The paintings Margaret insisted on buying. The grand staircase Kevin loved showing his friends. Everything here existed because of me. And now they were talking about removing me from it. But I didn't argue. I simply nodded. If that's what you think is best. Kevin seemed relieved. Margaret looked satisfied. And Laura avoided eye contact. That night, I realized something important. My family believed the bankruptcy had destroyed me. They believed I was weak. Finished. But what they didn't know was that the bankruptcy had only destroyed the company. Not me. Because 3 years earlier, I had quietly done something none of them knew about. Something that would change everything. But I wasn't ready to reveal it yet. First, I needed to see how far my family was willing to go. The dinner happened a month later. Kevin organized it. He said it was a fresh start for the family. We met at a fancy steakhouse downtown. Margaret wore one of her favorite dresses. Laura brought her husband, Mark. Kevin ordered an expensive bottle of wine. They laughed. They talked. But none of them asked how I was doing. Not once. Halfway through dinner, Kevin raised his glass. To new beginnings. Everyone lifted their glasses. Then he added something I will never forget. Sometimes failure teaches us what success never could. They all smiled politely. And that's when I realized something chilling. They weren't mourning my loss. They were relieved. Relieved that the man who built everything was finally powerless. I slowly lifted my glass. And I smiled. Because at that exact moment, I knew the truth they didn't. They thought I had lost everything. But the bank wasn't investigating anything. They were simply following instructions. My instructions. And that was just the beginning. Because the next move in this game was already in motion. And when my family discovered the truth, they would finally understand something very important. Bankruptcy had never been my downfall. It was my strategy, and they had just become part of it. But the real shock, the one that would destroy their confidence completely, was still coming. And it would start with a letter. A letter that arrived at Kevin's office 3 days later. A letter that made him realize his father wasn't nearly as powerless as he believed. But by the time he understood that, it would already be too late. 3 days after that dinner, Kevin received the letter. I know exactly when it happened, because I had been expecting the phone call. It was just after 9 in the morning when my phone rang. I was sitting on the small balcony of the apartment I had quietly moved into 2 weeks earlier. It wasn't a luxury place, just a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. Simple furniture, a small kitchen, a quiet view of a park across the street. To anyone watching from the outside, it probably looked like the sad landing spot of a man who had lost everything. But that apartment was exactly where I wanted to be, because it allowed everyone, including my own family, to believe the story they had already written in their minds. The phone rang again. Kevin. I let it ring twice before answering. Hello. His voice sounded tight. Dad, did you receive something from Whitmore Holdings? I smiled slightly. Whitmore Holdings. That name hadn't been spoken in our family for years. Yes, I said calmly. Why? There was a long pause on the other end. I just got a legal notice. I leaned back in my chair. What kind of notice? Kevin exhaled slowly. It says the house isn't owned by you anymore. I kept my voice steady. That's correct. Silence. Then he said something that almost made me laugh. What do you mean that's correct? The letter he received that morning had come from a law firm downtown. The same law firm that had helped me quietly restructure my assets 3 years earlier. The letter was simple. It explained that the house Kevin and Margaret believed belonged to me was actually owned by Whitmore Holdings, a holding company. And Whitmore Holdings was not part of the bankruptcy. Kevin's voice grew louder. Dad, the bank told me the house is controlled by that company. Yes. But you filed bankruptcy. Yes. So how is the house not included? I took a sip of my coffee. Because it isn't mine. Another long silence. 3 days after that dinner, Kevin received the letter. I know exactly when it happened, because I had been expecting the phone call. It was just after 9 in the morning when my phone rang. I was sitting on the small balcony of the apartment I had quietly moved into 2 weeks earlier. It wasn't a luxury place, just a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. Simple furniture, a small kitchen, a quiet view of a park across the street. To anyone watching from the outside, it probably looked like the sad landing spot of a man who had lost everything. But that apartment was exactly where I wanted to be, because it allowed everyone, including my own family, to believe the story they had already written in their minds. The phone rang again. Kevin. I let it ring twice before answering. Hello. His voice sounded tight. Dad, did you receive something from Whitmore Holdings? I smiled slightly. Whitmore Holdings. That name hadn't been spoken in our family for years. Yes, I said calmly. Why? There was a long pause on the other end. I just got a legal notice. I leaned back in my chair. What kind of notice? Kevin exhaled slowly. It says the house isn't owned by you anymore. I kept my voice steady. That's correct. Silence. Then he said something that almost made me laugh. What do you mean that's correct? The letter he received that morning had come from a law firm downtown. The same law firm that had helped me quietly restructure my assets 3 years earlier. The letter was simple. It explained that the house Kevin and Margaret believed belonged to me was actually owned by Whitmore Holdings, a holding company. And Whitmore Holdings was not part of the bankruptcy. Kevin's voice grew louder. Dad, the bank told me the house is controlled by that company. Yes. But you filed bankruptcy. Yes. So how is the house not included? I took a sip of my coffee. Because it isn't mine. Another long silence. Then Kevin asked the question I had been waiting for. Then who owns it? I looked out across the park. Children were playing near the swings. A dog chased a ball across the grass. Peaceful. Very peaceful. The company does, I said. Kevin sounded confused. Then who owns the company? That was when I finally said it. I do. The silence that followed lasted almost 10 seconds. Kevin's voice came back softer. That doesn't make sense. It makes perfect sense. 3 years earlier, when business was still booming, I had noticed something troubling in the market. Developers were becoming reckless. Banks were lending too aggressively. The entire construction industry felt fragile. I had seen crashes before, and I wasn't willing to gamble my entire life's work on optimism. So I did something very few people knew about. I created Whitmore Holdings, a completely separate company. Then, over the next year, I quietly transferred several key assets into it. The house, 2 rental properties, a commercial warehouse outside the city, and a significant investment portfolio. All perfectly legal, all perfectly documented, and most importantly, completely separate from Whitmore Construction, which meant when the construction company collapsed, those assets remained untouched. Kevin finally spoke again. So, the house isn't part of the bankruptcy. No. And you still control it. Yes. He sounded angry now. Why didn't you tell us this? I paused before answering. Because nobody asked. Kevin hung up without saying goodbye. I expected that. Less than 2 hours later, my phone rang again. Margaret. Her voice was colder than usual. Daniel, what exactly is going on? I could almost imagine her standing in the kitchen, pacing the marble floor she loved so much. What do you mean? Kevin showed me the letter. I assumed he would. You transferred the house? Yes. When? 3 years ago. She sounded shocked. You never told me. No. Why? I didn't hesitate. Because you would have told Kevin. Another long silence. Margaret always hated when I answered honestly. Her voice sharpened. So what happens now? That depends. On what? On whether the company decides to sell the property. Margaret's voice rose immediately. Sell the property? Yes. You can't sell the house. I corrected her calmly. I can. You wouldn't do that to your own family. That sentence stayed in the air for a moment. Your own family. I almost asked her the same question. But instead I said something simple. Margaret, the house belongs to Whitmore Holdings. And the company's board will decide what to do with it. The board? Yes. Who's on the board? I smiled. I am. She hung up. By lunchtime, the panic had started. Kevin called again. Laura called. Even Mark, my son-in-law, tried reaching me. But the most interesting call came that evening. It was from Richard, my old CFO. Daniel, he said, Kevin just came into my office. I wasn't surprised. And he asked if the holding company was real. What did you tell him? The truth. And how did he react? Richard chuckled softly. He looked like someone pulled the ground out from under his feet. That was exactly what I expected. Because Kevin had already started making plans after the bankruptcy. Plans he thought I would never discover. Plans that depended on me being completely powerless. But Kevin had forgotten something important. Before he was my son, I was his boss. And bosses see things employees miss. 2 weeks before the bankruptcy filing, Kevin had approached several investors. He told them Whitmore Construction was collapsing. But he also told them something else. He claimed he could rebuild the company under new leadership. His leadership. He promised them control of the remaining contracts. and in return, they would finance his takeover. Kevin believed he was rescuing the company. In reality, he was preparing to replace me. Richard told me everything. Every meeting, every email, every investor conversation. When he finished explaining, I only asked one question. Did he sign anything? Richard hesitated. Yes. That answer was exactly what I needed. Because Kevin had unknowingly made a serious mistake. The contracts he signed with those investors included something very interesting. A personal liability clause, which meant if the deals collapsed, Kevin would be personally responsible for millions of dollars. At the time, Kevin believed the company would survive. Now the company was bankrupt, which meant those investors were about to start asking questions. And when they did, Kevin would discover what real financial pressure felt like. But that wasn't the twist that shocked my family the most. The real surprise came 4 days later. It started with another letter. This one arrived at the house, addressed to Margaret. Inside was a formal notice from Whitmore Holdings, a property evaluation request. Margaret called me immediately. What is this? The company is reviewing all assets. You're evaluating the house? Yes. Why? Because it might be sold. Margaret sounded furious. You can't do that. I remained calm. The company can. That house is our home. No, I corrected gently. It's the company's property. I could hear Laura in the background asking questions. Margaret lowered her voice. Daniel, don't do this. Do what? Punish us. That word caught my attention. Punish. Interesting. You think this is punishment? Yes. I paused. No, Margaret. This is business. Another silence. Then she said something that revealed exactly what she believed. You're doing this because you're angry about the bankruptcy. I almost laughed. If only she knew. The bankruptcy had never been my problem. It had been my protection. And the real plan, the one nobody in my family had even imagined yet, was already moving forward. Because Whitmore Construction may have collapsed, but the most valuable contracts the company ever had quietly moved somewhere else weeks earlier. To a different company. A company Kevin had never heard of. A company that was about to announce its first major project. And when that announcement became public, my family would finally understand something very important. I hadn't lost my business. I had simply changed its name. And the man running it was still me. But the person helping me rebuild everything was someone my family never expected. An old partner. A man Kevin had insulted years ago. A man who had been waiting patiently for the moment to return. And when he stepped back into the story, the real revenge would finally begin. Because the next meeting Kevin attended with his investors was going to end in complete disaster. And this time, there would be no one left to save him. The real collapse of my son's life started on a Tuesday morning. Ironically, it began in a room where Kevin believed he was about to become powerful. The investors' meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock. Kevin had arranged it himself. 3 private investors, 2 attorneys, and Kevin sitting at the head of the table, ready to present what he believed was his future. At least, that's what Richard later told me. Richard had quietly attended the meeting as well. Officially, he was there to clarify the financial state of Whitmore Construction. But in reality, he was there to watch what happened when Kevin's plan finally hit reality. Kevin stood confidently at the front of the room. A large screen behind him showed his presentation. Whitmore Construction Recovery Plan. Richard said. Kevin spoke for almost 20 minutes. He talked about rebuilding the company, new leadership, new partnerships, fresh capital. To someone who didn't know the full story, Kevin probably sounded impressive, confident, prepared, like a man ready to take control. But then one of the investors asked a simple question. Mr. Whitmore, before we continue, we need clarification. Kevin smiled politely. Of course. The investor slid a folder across the table. We discovered something interesting this morning. Kevin opened the folder. Inside were legal documents, contracts, property transfers, corporate filings. Richard said. Kevin's face slowly changed as he read them. What is this? Kevin asked. The investor leaned forward. These are filings from a company called Whitmore Holdings. Kevin looked confused. Yes, that's my father's holding company. The investor shook his head. No, Mr. Whitmore. He tapped one of the documents. This company now owns several assets that were previously linked to Whitmore Construction. Kevin frowned. That's not possible. But it was possible. Because Whitmore Holdings didn't just own the house. It also owned the warehouse, the rental properties, and something far more important, The land contracts connected to two major commercial projects. Projects Kevin believed were still part of Whitmore construction. Projects he had promised to his investors. The investor continued. You presented these contracts as part of your recovery plan. Kevin looked at the documents again. Yes, they are. No, the investor replied calmly. They aren't. He pointed to a line in the paperwork. These contracts were transferred to another company 2 weeks before the bankruptcy. Kevin's voice rose. That's impossible. The investor asked a quiet question. Have you heard of Whitmore Development Group? Kevin shook his head. No. Richard said. The room became completely silent. Because everyone else in that room had heard of it. Whitmore Development Group. A brand new company. Quietly registered just 1 month earlier. And the owner of that company was me. When Kevin realized what had happened, he looked like someone had drained all the blood from his face. Richard said. Kevin whispered something under his breath. My father. Yes, his father. While Kevin was busy planning how to take over my failing company, I had already started building a new one. But the meeting wasn't over yet. One of the attorneys spoke next. Mr. Whitmore, there's another issue. Kevin looked up slowly. What issue? The attorney opened another document. The investment agreement you signed. Kevin swallowed. Yes. It includes a personal guarantee clause. Kevin's voice suddenly sounded uncertain. Yes, but that only applies if the company fails. The attorney looked directly at him. The company has failed. The words hung in the room like a thunderclap. Kevin leaned back in his chair. You're saying? I'm responsible. The investor answered calmly. Yes. Kevin's voice cracked slightly. How much? The investor didn't hesitate. $5.4 million. Richard told me. Kevin stopped breathing for a moment. 5.4 million. That number echoed in his mind like a siren. Because Kevin didn't have $5 million. Kevin barely had 500,000. And most of that money came from me. The investors stood up. One of them gave Kevin a sympathetic look. You should speak to your attorney. Then they walked out. Just like that. Kevin's dream of becoming the new leader of Whitmore Construction had collapsed. And his nightmare had just begun. I didn't hear about the meeting until later that evening. Kevin showed up at my apartment around 7 o'clock. He looked different. Pale. Shaken. For the first time in weeks. He looked like a man who didn't know what to do. I opened the door slowly. Hello, Kevin. He pushed past me without waiting for an invitation. You planned this. I closed the door calmly. Plan what? You transferred those contracts. Yes. You created another company. Yes. Kevin turned toward me, furious. You ruined everything. I sat down at the small dining table. No, Kevin. You ruined everything. His fists clenched. You set a trap for me. I shook my head slowly. No. You knew I was talking to investors. Yes. You knew I was trying to save the company. That sentence almost made me laugh. Save the company? Kevin's anger exploded. I was trying to fix your mistakes. There it was. The truth Kevin had been carrying inside him. I leaned forward. My mistakes. Yes. You bankrupted the company. Actually, I said calmly. The market bankrupted the company. Kevin paced across the apartment. You made us look like fools. No, I replied quietly. You did that yourself. Kevin stopped pacing. Then he said something that revealed just how desperate he was becoming. You need to transfer those contracts back. I raised an eyebrow. Why? Because those investors are coming after me. That sounds like your problem. Kevin's voice rose again. They're suing me. I shrugged slightly. You signed the agreement. You knew that clause was there. Yes. Kevin stared at me in disbelief. You let me sign it anyway? I looked him directly in the eyes. You never asked for my advice. That sentence hit him harder than anything else I said. Because it was true. Kevin had stopped asking for my advice long before the bankruptcy. He believed he was smarter than me. More modern. More capable. Now he was discovering something painful. Experience matters. Kevin sat down across from me. His voice suddenly sounded smaller. What am I supposed to do? I answered honestly. I don't know. You're my father. Yes. Help me. That was the moment I had been waiting for. Not revenge. Not humiliation. Just honesty. For the first time in months. Kevin looked like a son again. Not a rival. Not a critic. Just a frightened man who realized he had made terrible decisions. But before I could respond, my phone rang. It was Richard. Daniel, you should turn on the news. Why? The city council just announced the Riverside Project. The Riverside Project. That name made me smile. Because it was the largest commercial development contract in the region, a project worth almost $200 million. Kevin watched my face carefully. What is it? I picked up the remote and turned on the television. The local news station was already covering the announcement. The reporter spoke excitedly. The city council has officially approved the Riverside Development Project. The winning bid has been awarded to a new company. Kevin leaned forward. The reporter continued. Whitmore Development Group. Kevin's eyes widened. That's your company? Yes. The reporter finished the sentence. Led by construction veteran Daniel Whitmore. Kevin leaned back slowly. He finally understood the truth. I hadn't lost everything. I had simply started over. And this time, I was building something without the people who had stopped believing in me. Kevin whispered something I will never forget. You were never bankrupt. I corrected him gently. No, Kevin. The company was bankrupt. And you? I looked around my small apartment. The quiet room. The peaceful view outside the window. I was preparing. Kevin sat in silence for a long time. Then he asked one final question. What happens to us? That question carried more meaning than he realized. Because the real answer, the one that would change everything for my entire family, was about to arrive the next morning. It would come in the form of another letter. But this letter wouldn't go to Kevin. It would go to Margaret. And when she read it, she would finally understand something that would terrify her. The house she loved so much was officially going on the market. And for the first time in 20 years, my family was about to discover what it felt like to lose their home. The letter arrived the next morning. It was delivered just after 9 o'clock. Margaret was sitting in the kitchen of the house when the doorbell rang. The same kitchen she had decorated herself years ago with marble countertops and expensive cabinets she insisted we install. She loved that kitchen. It was the center of the home she had proudly shown to every friend who visited. According to Laura, Margaret walked to the door expecting another package. Instead, she found a courier holding a sealed envelope. The envelope had the logo of a law firm printed neatly in the corner. Margaret signed for it without thinking much about it. Then she opened it at the kitchen table. At first, she didn't understand what she was reading. The letter was formal, cold, precise. It explained that Whitmore Holdings had completed its internal review of company assets. It also explained something else. The property located at their address, our house, would officially be listed for sale within 14 days. Margaret read that sentence 3 times. Then she called Kevin. Her voice was shaking. Kevin, you need to come over right now. Kevin arrived 20 minutes later. He had barely slept after leaving my apartment the night before. The meeting with the investors had already begun to unravel his life. Now he walked into the house and saw Margaret sitting at the table with the letter in her hand. Laura was standing near the window. What's going on? Kevin asked. Margaret handed him the letter. Kevin read it silently. Halfway through the page, his shoulders dropped. He's actually doing it, Kevin said quietly. Margaret's voice cracked. He can't do this to us. Kevin looked at her carefully. Mom, technically, it's his company. Laura spoke softly from across the room. So what do we do? Kevin didn't answer. Because Kevin already knew something important. For the first time in his life, he didn't have control. And neither did anyone else in that house. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. Margaret again. I knew exactly why she was calling. I answered calmly. Hello. Her voice was different this time. Not angry. Not cold. Afraid. Daniel, we need to talk. We're talking. You know what I mean. Yes. There was a long pause. Are you really selling the house? Yes. Her breathing became uneven. Why? The truth was simple. Because it was time. But I didn't say that. Instead, I answered with a question. Margaret, do you remember the family meeting? She was silent. The one where Kevin suggested selling the house. That was different. How? You still owned it then? No, I corrected gently. I didn't. Another silence. You're punishing us. No. Then what is this? This, I said calmly, is a consequence. Margaret didn't reply for several seconds. Then she whispered something that surprised me. We didn't realize how much you were carrying. That sentence stayed in the air between us. For 35 years I had carried everything. The company, the risk, the pressure, the responsibility. And when it collapsed, the first thing my family did was push me aside. Now they were finally seeing the truth. Margaret spoke again. Where are we supposed to go? I answered honestly. You'll find somewhere. That house is our life. No, I said quietly. It's just a house. Margaret began to cry. I hadn't heard her cry like that in a very long time. But something inside me had already moved past anger. I felt calm, very calm, because the real ending of this story wasn't about revenge. It was about something far more important. The next twist arrived 3 days later. Kevin called me late in the evening. His voice sounded exhausted. They filed the lawsuit. The investors? Yes. How much? 5.4 million. I already knew that. But hearing Kevin say it out loud made the reality sink in. What are you going to do? I asked. I don't know. For the first time in weeks. Kevin sounded humble. I thought I understood business. I didn't interrupt him. I thought I understood risk. He paused. But I didn't understand you. That sentence surprised me. Kevin continued. You saw everything before it happened. I leaned back in my chair. Experience teaches you that. Kevin let out a tired laugh. I guess I should have listened more. Maybe. But life has a way of teaching lessons that words never can. A week later, the house officially went on the market. Real estate agents walked through every room. Photographers took pictures. The listing appeared online that same afternoon. Within hours, people were scheduling viewings. Margaret called me again that night. They're walking through the house like strangers. I said nothing. They're opening our closets. Still nothing. They're judging our home. Then she asked something quietly. Does this make you happy? I thought about that question carefully. No. Then why are you doing it? Because sometimes the only way people understand value is when they lose something. Margaret didn't argue, because deep down she understood what I meant. 2 weeks later, the house sold. The buyer was a retired couple moving from another state. They loved the property. They paid in cash. Whitmore Holdings finalized the sale quickly. Margaret and Kevin moved into a smaller home across town. Laura moved in with her husband. For the first time in decades, our family lived separate lives. But the story didn't end there. 3 months later, something unexpected happened. Kevin came to visit me again. But this time he didn't arrive angry. He arrived quiet. We sat in the small living room of my apartment. The same apartment he had once looked at with disbelief. How's the company? He asked. Growing. That Riverside project must be huge. It is. Kevin nodded slowly. I'm glad. There was no bitterness in his voice anymore. Just acceptance. What about the lawsuit? I asked. We're negotiating. With $5 million? He smiled weakly. I might spend the next 10 years paying it back. That was a hard lesson. But Kevin looked different now. More careful. More thoughtful. Then he said something that meant more to me than anything else. I'm going to start over. That's good. Small business this time. What kind? A construction consulting service. I smiled. That sounds familiar. Kevin laughed softly. I guess I'm finally learning from the right teacher. That moment told me everything I needed to know. People don't grow when life is easy. They grow when they face the consequences of their choices. And my family had finally faced theirs. 6 months later, Whitmore Development Group officially opened its new headquarters. A modest building. Nothing flashy. Just a solid company built on experience. Richard remained my CFO. And the Riverside project became one of the largest developments in the state. Sometimes I drive past it in the evening. The cranes. The lights. The workers finishing another day. And I remember something important. Losing everything can feel like the end. But sometimes, it's just the beginning of something stronger. Because the night my family believed I had lost everything was actually the night I finally discovered who truly believed in me and who didn't.